Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Amanda Potter. I'm the Curator of Education and Interpretation at the Zimmerli Art Museum at Rutgers University. Before we begin this evening's program, I want to thank our partners who have joined with us to make Day Without Art 2020 a true university-wide collaboration. They are Rutgers Global, Mason Gross School for the Arts, Rutgers School of Public Health, Rutgers Student Health, Rutgers Global Health Institute, Rutgers Center for Social Justice Education and LGBT Communities, and the Office of the Chancellor, Rutgers New Brunswick. Today's programming is also supported by the Thomas Sokolowski Memorial Fund. I also want to thank everyone at Visual Aids, who year after year organize compelling programming to keep those around the world who live with HIV/AIDS and those we have lost visible on a national and international scale through the arts. Visual Aids is a New York-based nonprofit that utilizes art to fight AIDS by provoking dialogue, supporting HIV-positive artists, and preserving a legacy, because AIDS is not over. One of the founders of Visual Aids was our director, Thomas Sokolowski, and we dedicate today's programming to his memory. If you head to the website go.rutgers.edu/December 1st, or check out our social media feeds, we've been sharing tributes to Tom throughout the day. And with an excerpt from one of those tributes, One Singular Sensation, a documentary short made by Sam Vladimirsky, a Rutgers alum and former intern. The film is a compelling tribute to Tom's remarkable life and legacy. And this excerpt focuses on Tom's role in coalescing awareness and action about AIDS in the art world and beyond. Without further ado.
We're going to get worried and throw money into something to save homosexuals, even though it was a lie.
It left out the fact that people were living with AIDS, not just dying of AIDS. And that was the problem with a great deal of the imagery that was selected by media when they eventually started looking at it.
And it just struck me that all there were these statistics, 8,000 here and 5,000 more. And we decided, all right, what are we going to do?
There were rumblings all around in the art world and in the gay world. It was, there was a noise. Never be silent again, no, 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 never be silent again, no. Tom brought it into the museum world. That was unique.
Which give importance to these new images, to a new lifestyle. But I think, as we've seen, a lifestyle which is not so new, but rather dates back to classical times. Since if we look closely, behind the scenes, behind the backs, we have grasping.
Tom just let me do what I was going to do.
Tom takes great pride in her being the first kind of New York solo show devoted to AIDS images.
Well, I knew that it was going to be a big project. He actually allowed me to edit and sequence everything.
We didn't want to frame any of the images because we didn't want to have sort of like a barrier. They were just sort of hung right on the wall, pinned to the wall.
The ones who could came to the opening and they loved it.
I think Tom's activism was deeply part of him. Like, it wasn't even that he brought it on purpose, it was just part of the way he worked as a curator.
So a group of people met in my apartment with the temptation of my fabulous cooking, and there were 4 people in the art world. And we were not captains of industry. Many of us ran art galleries and smaller organizations. And we found that putting the smarts that we had learned from our educations and our jobs, to a certain degree, I suppose, from our upbringings, we could make a change.
And they did stuff in those institutions around them, and they pushed them to do that, and they got a lot of pushback for it too.
I was the representative of the biggest museum in the room at that time. So I called a bunch of museum directors across the country, at least 10 or 12 people that I had known from different lives, and said, what do you think? Would you do a moratorium? And they said, to a person, they said, no, that's too negative. but we will do something. I took that information back to the Visual AIDS organization, and we decided to call it Day Without Art, put it on the World AIDS Day, and to let people celebrate it, as it were, memorialize it in any way they saw fit.
Some of them put, shrouds over paintings. Some of them did close, the ones that could.
So the first year we had multiple hundreds of institutions involved, and it was all by basically word of mouth. What I was able to get MoMA to do to participate in the first Day Without Art was a memorial service. So on the day before, on the eve of World AIDS Day, first Day Without Art, David Wojnarowicz read, Leonard Bernstein played a series of pieces that he'd written in commemoration of people, friends of his who had died.
Symbols are very important. So we thought to provide the larger world with something that they could accommodate and yet could stand out.
In 1990, we debuted the Red Ribbon Project on the Tonys. For years, you could see red ribbons on every awards show.
This costuming is going to be worn today for the Gay Pride March, for the Visual AIDS contingent, for the first Celebrity Ribbon Cavalcade. And they're all costumes that use the red ribbon as a central theme and motif to show our support for people with AIDS, in order to get the word out that America needs to look at AIDS and look at it seriously.
I mean, we were like Red Ribbon Central. We did all the cutting of red ribbons in the beginning, early on, before we could get more volunteers.
If we wouldn't have had Visual AIDS and ACT UP, what would there be? Nothing. Point blank, that's it.
It took the Red Ribbon Project, it took Night Without Light, it took all of these different kinds of things to sort of develop a consensus that was broad enough to make it so that AIDS research became a part of the medical world's, the scientific world's sort of agenda.
There was no concerted effort to do what Tom achieved anywhere in the art world.
Night Without Light and Day Without Art, that's how it got there.
What Tom will be known for is a program, not individual shows, because it was a novel he was writing.
And it shows you that if you have energy, if you're creative, and you learn the conduits of your world, you can achieve anything.
Because some of the on-screen identifications happened prior to this excerpt, I just wanted to mention that you just heard from Sir Rodney Sir, Philip Yenawine, Arnie Svensson, Lynn Gumpert, Michelle Wong, Rosalind Fox-Solomon, and Kathy Halbreich. I hope you'll watch the entire film, the link for which is in the chat and on our website. So that was the then of AIDS activism and the arts. To give a picture of the now, we will now show Cuido, a short clip from Chile by Las Indetectables, which was commissioned by Visual Arts as a part of Transmissions, its 31st annual Day Without Art project. You can find the entire powerful program at visualaids.org/transmissions. After Cuido, we'll begin our discussion with special guests Nelson Santos, Alan Frame, Dr. Perry Halkitis, and Donna Gustafson, moderated by Jeanine Oleson.
Soy maricón, así que pierdan todas las esperanzas de que cambie, decía en mi casa a los 18. Soy travesti, les comentaba hace poco en el mismo lugar. Algunos le dicen salir del closet, primero de cola, después de mariconcito que se cree mujer. Y mira tú, ahora viene con que es puta. Me fui por el lado malo de lo trans, escuchaba una amiga. Claramente yo no soy la Daniela Vega. Me gané otro Oscar. De esos que me mantendrán positiva de por vida. Me fui por el camino de las que no les alcanzó para más. Las fracasás, las de la vida fácil, las sucias, a las que les faltó conocer el amor y escapar de ser de esas cacheras angustiadas esperando la droga, esperando la callita, esperando los monitos, esperando la línea, esperando el pito, esperando el placer que me saque de toda esta mierda. Y comprendo tu preocupación, porque cuando nos diagnostican el bicho, el VIH, nos recuerdan la muerte. Es lo mismo cuando yo les digo a mi familia, a mis amigues, a mis amores o a alguna otra persona, algún otro mariconcito, alguna otra traba, de que soy travesti. Les recuerdo la muerte, porque si no nos mata la pobreza, lo hará algún machito, algún weón que se cree hombre en la calle, que nos asesina a sangre fría porque le bajó la culpa. Las identidades inmundas, inhumanas, ya estamos sentenciadas a la muerte. Una traba me preguntó por ahí la otra vez, insistía y insistía y me decía: amiga, ¿te cuidáis? ¿Tú te cuidas? ¿Te cuidas? ¿Realmente te cuidas? Y bueno, yo le respondí: por supuesto que me cuido. Me cuido de aguantarle la legendaria idea de que las colas traemos las plagas de Egipto, como nos gritan los evangélicos cuando cantamos en la micro. Me cuido. Me cuido de aguantar sus mitos patriarcales que buscan seguir dejándonos en el lugar del margen de lo otro, lo inhumano, lo asesinable. A esos maricones que se pueden matar, a esa gente que merece morir. Me cuido. Me cuido de reprimir mi sexualidad a la norma. Que eso de la pareja única, que de la monogamia, el amor. El amor, lo siento, una siempre promiscua. Ay. ¡Ay! ¡Ay! ¡Qué rico! ¡Dale! No parís, dale. Dame más por ahí, dame un monito, una línea, un saque, dale. No lo saqué. ¡Ay! Me cuido de mí, me cuido de todos los que están en mí. Me cuido de quien está en mí, de mi padre, de mi madre, de mis hermanos, mis amigues, de los amantes, los cacheros. ¡Me cuido! Me cuido de seguir alimentando la moral culposa cristiana, esa que tanto daño nos sigue haciendo. Me cuido. Me cuido de creer en la enfermedad. ¿Qué es eso de que estáis enferma? ¿Estáis enferma, conchetumare?
Oye, amiga, ¿y te cuidaste?
¿Estáis enferma, amiga?
Oye, amiga, ¿y usaste condón?
¿Acaso tú estás muy sana, weona? ¿Sana de qué? ¿Sana para quién? Me cuido. Me cuido de creer en lo bueno y lo malo. Me cuido. Me cuido de que mis ojos solo vean normalidad y anormalidad. Me cuido. Y hago el esfuerzo día a día de cuidarme, de querer ser hombre y de cuidarme, de querer ser la más mujer.
Now my pleasure to turn things over to Jeanine Oleson, professor at Rutgers Mason Gross School of the Arts and an interdisciplinary artist based in Brooklyn. Among her many accomplishments are 3 books, What? And the Greater New York Smudge Cleanse, both in 2012, and a new book, Conduct Matters, published just earlier this spring. Since 2013, she's also been a lead collaborator on a participatory project, Photo Requests from Solitary, that provides images to people held in solitary confinement and supports advocacy efforts to end the practice in US prisons. Just a housekeeping note, if you have questions for our panelists, please use the Q&A function and we'll address as many of them live as possible. And now I'll turn things over to Jeanine to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I really appreciate your introduction, and thank you to everyone here tonight in celebration of Day Without Art and not so much of a celebration of Day Without Tom. But it's been great to, I'm new to Rutgers, and this was something that I had done previously at the previous institution as host these screenings, and it was kind of amazing this year to realize the convergence of how important this that visual arts is to the Zimmerli and across thinking about public health as well. So I'm very happy to be a part of that. And I do also want to thank Perry, Donna, Allen, and Nelson for being here to talk tonight about Tom Sokolowski and the work he did within art institutions and the ongoing AIDS epidemic. And so I'm going to introduce them and then open with some initial prompts and questions, and hopefully that will get the conversation going. So first person I'd like to introduce is Donna Gustafson. She's the interim director of the Zimmerli and the curator of modern and contemporary art here at Rutgers. She holds the post of the Andrew W. Mellon Director for Academic Programs and has focused efforts in incorporating the University Art Museum into the life of the university through programs, classes, and collaborations with various academic departments at Rutgers and the medical school. Her publications and exhibition projects at the Zimmerli include Tiananmen Square, 1989, photographs by Kyung H. Hae, Subjective Objective, A Century of Social Photography in 2017, Jesse Crimes, Apocalyptine, 1638967 in 2014, Rachel Perry Welty, 24/7 in 2012, At Around Beyond, Fluxus at Rutgers in 2011, Water at 2010, and Lala Essayade, Le Femme du Maroc in 2010 as well. She's co-author with Andres Mario Zervignon of Subjective Objective, A Century of Social Photography, published by Hermer in 2017, and author of George Segal in Black and White, photographs by Donald Lakuta, published by the Zimmerli. Also Amelia and the Animals, photographs of Robin Schwartz, by Aperture in 2014, Almost Human, Dolls and Robots in Contemporary Art, published by Hunterdon Art Museum in 2005, and Images from the World Between the Circus and 20th Century American Art, published by MIT in 2001. She's published reviews and articles, presented papers, and participated in symposia and panels on a variety of topics on photography, American and contemporary art. Her current project is an exhibition on the image and text of American activist and scholar Angela Davis to open at the Zimmerli Art Museum in 2021. Our next panelist is Alan Frame, a photographer and writer based in New York and represented by Gitterman Gallery in New York, where his most recent solo exhibition was in 2019. He's the winner of the 2017-18 Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome, and recent work he made while in Rome was presented in an exhibition in Innamorato at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. His 2013 exhibition, Dialogue with Bologna, was presented at the Museum of Art of the Sonora in Hermosillo, Mexico in 2014. Detour, a compilation of his photographs over a decade, was published in 2001. He has been curator of numerous exhibitions, including Daryl Ellis, which we'll see in 2016 at Art in General. He has some slides of Daryl's work to show this evening, and photographs of Charles Henry Ford at Mitchell August Gallery, which I think is up now. In 2000, I keep saying 2000, in 1990, he curated a slide projection project about AIDS called Electric Blanket with Nan Golden and toured it with Frank Franka throughout the US into many foreign countries, including Japan, Norway, Hungary, and Russia. He's an adjunct professor of photography at the Pratt Institute and also teaches at the School of Visual Arts in the International Center of Photography. Dr. Perry Halkitis, PhD, MS, MPH, is a public health psychologist, researcher, educator, and advocate who is Dean and Professor of Biostatistics and Urban Global Public Health at the Rutgers School for Public Health. Dr. Halkitis is the founder and director of the Center for Health, Identity, Behavior, and Prevention Studies. For 3 decades, Dr. Halkitis' program of research has examined the intersection between HIV, HPV, and other STIs, drug abuse, and mental health burden with regard to the biological, behavioral, psychosocial, and structural factors that predispose these and other health disparities in the LGBTQ plus population. His work focuses on the translation of this knowledge through implementation science research that examines the effectiveness of tailored and adaptive interventions in order to prevent and eliminate these disparities. His research program has been awarded over $30 million in grant funding. Most recently, he has been involved in New Jersey's contact tracing efforts, helping to develop the curriculum and launch the New Jersey Community Contact Tracing Corps. And our last panelist is Nelson Santos, who is an artist, curator, and consultant advocating for artists and working with nonprofit organizations to facilitate fundraising, strategic planning and producing exhibitions, public programs, artist projects, and publications. Santos served as the interim director of curatorial programs at the Leslie Lohman Museum, and before that as the director of visual aids from 2000 to 2017, which is an organization we'll talk about a lot tonight, where he launched an international film screening series for Day Without Art, which you just saw an excerpt of, and established a curatorial residency for the research of art and cultural history around HIV/AIDS, and launched Duets, an ongoing publication series which pairs artists, activists, and writers in dialogues about their creative practices and social justice issues. He's currently the board president of Queer Art. Santos is working on an ongoing artist project in Fort Greene Park and lives and works in Brooklyn with his partner of 14 years and his dog, Timmy. So I guess from there, I'd say I'm very curious to just pose some initial questions to all of you. And I think there are quite a few different connections that you may have with each other. And we've talked about this hopefully being a casual and not presentation based, but more about conversation. And so I guess the first question, I think, to sort of establish where you're coming from, the four of you, can you talk about your work in the arts, in public health, HIV/AIDS advocacy, and your relationship to Tom? So I think that will be an important point of connection. Would anyone like to talk about that first? Could I maybe ask Nelson, would you be willing to speak about that first, actually?
And that's my story. Sorry about that. So I moved to New York in 2000 and began working at Visual Aids at that time. And I was the associate director working with Amy Sadow for about 10 years, and then became the executive director in 2012 through 2017. And I feel very fortunate to have walked into and learned from an organization that has such a long and rich history. That's how I got to know Tom. Tom, actually, when I started in 2000, one of the first things we did was we took a trip to Pittsburgh because an artist member was doing a sort of a benefit for us out there. And so I got to meet Tom when he was at the Warhol Museum. And then he was someone I certainly would always turn back to and Robert Atkins as well, often to get that history, that institutional knowledge. One of the things I think is kind of amazing about Visual AIDS as an organization is that they've always done so much, such big projects that we saw some of, and I'm sure we'll talk more of, but something like Day Without Art was basically, well, actually at that point when they started Day Without Art, there wasn't even an incorporated organization. It was a grassroots, right? So there was like 4 main people putting it together, and then a whole lot of volunteers. And it sort of continued that way. In 1990, they hired the first executive director, and it continued to be like a 2-person staff for most of its time. Even when I was there, it was a 2-person staff. And so it's interesting. I'm sorry, I can talk about Visual AIDS for maybe a little too long, but it's interesting to see how each director or each founder or each group at that time sort of directed the organization in different ways. And definitely Day Without Art is still that Robert and Tom and Bill Lender and Gary Garrels started, is definitely still one of those real backbone projects for the organization. I'll leave it at that, maybe. Alan, you have a lot more earlier history with.
Yeah, I was thinking that because you were involved in the artist caucus of Visual AIDS early on, which I saw an image of. It was an image from Electric Blanket, correct? In the slides, yeah.
Being projected on the facade of Cooper Union in 1990.
Right.
When I joined Visual AIDS, it was mostly arts administrators, and there were just like maybe 3 artists who were involved, and Nan Golden was one of them. She had just curated the controversial show Witnesses Against Their Vanishing at Artist Space. I was in that show. And she reached out to me and invited me into the Artist Caucus. So at our first meeting, it was Nan, Paul H.O., and Frank Moore, and I were the first artists in that. And at the first meeting, because Nan and I both had experience with slideshows, we decided to do a big projection piece for Day Without Art in 1990. And we reached out to photo editors and curators and photographers to get as much material as we could that was that included documentary depictions of people living with AIDS, documentations of AIDS actions by ACT UP, and instances of caregiving, and portraits of people that were done by fine art photographers, as well as donated snapshots by people who were memorializing them. And we included all of that and structured it with slide statistics, slide titles that had statistics and data about the pandemic. So the first time we presented it, it was like 16 carousels of work. It took hours to project on that night. And later we modified it and toured it. And as we toured it, we invited the new communities to add to it. So we were constantly re-editing, including a sort of core group of images, but adding and changing statistics and data as well. And we continued to do that until around 2002 in Russia. We went to Russia twice around that time. And then there have been a few projections of it since then. But, you know, our first meetings of Visual AIDS, because of Philip Yenowin, were in a boardroom at MoMA. I found it a little bit intimidating to be, you know, one of the few artists among all of these kind of prominent arts administrators, including Philip and Tom. and people like Robert Atkins. And, but those people were so warm and supportive and would, show up at these events and tell us how to do budgets and, provide all sorts of useful support and information. My relationship with Tom, after a few years, I was asked to be on the board, and I was on the visual aids board for a year or two. And so my relationship with Tom was always kind of formal. In the 80s, I had shown him my work when he was at the Gray Art Gallery, and so we were like curator and artist. But I regret that I didn't get to know him beyond the formalities. So I called Patrick O'Connell, who was the first executive director of visual aids and there for years, especially when I was doing projects, and asked him to talk to me about the other side of Tom that I didn't know. And my favorite thing that he said, besides emphasizing how kind he was, what a great, lively, and engaging lecturer, and how bold and brilliant he was in that capacity as an art historian and curator, was that he was cooking for Patrick and his partner Jimmy at home, and he took a moment to think about the decor in the apartment. He said, I'm thinking of repainting the apartment a muscular chartreuse. And I think that just that very color says something about his colorful imagination and sensibility. When I remember a board meeting in which, having created the Red Ribbon Project, and I was among a group of artists that created that project collectively, the US government had decided to do a postage stamp based on the ribbon, and they'd forgotten to do any research to find out who created it and who could give them the rights to do that. So we got in touch with them, but in the process, we got a copyright lawyer to come in and talk to us about all the issues involved with trying to protect that as a copyright and whether we wanted to, and we decided not to, because we'd always wanted it to be something that was easy for people to make on their own, that people didn't have to be charged for, and we just wanted to release that idea. Although at the very beginning of it, we were met constantly through that first summer to create the ribbons so that we could hand them out, including at the Tony Awards that first year that it evolved. And there was that clip in the video of Jeremy Irons at the Tony Awards wearing the red ribbon, but he couldn't say what it meant because the producers of the show had discouraged anyone from doing anything political. But so many people were curious, and throughout the year, it wound up being a part of all of these different award ceremonies, so that it eventually became this incredibly significant piece of graphic design and icon of that time.
Thank you, Alan. I was thinking that it might be interesting, Donna, if you wanted to sort of follow some of that institutional trail as someone who worked with Tom most recently at the Zimmerli.
Sure, Jeanine, I'd be very happy to. And I want to say, like Alan, I wish that I knew more about Tom or more of Tom than I did. So I met Tom in 2017 when he came to the Zimmerli Art Museum to be the director. And I was just opening my show, which was the social documentary show, and I had to give him a tour in the afternoon. And I was trying to give him a tour and talk about the art historical aspects of the show and whatever. And he wanted to know a lot about the gossip of Rutgers University, and he wanted me to tell him about who was who and what was what and what should he expect. And he was invited to the dinner that evening, and Gary Snyder was there, who was teaching Mason Gross at the time. And he was so excited to meet Tom because he remembered the Peter Hujar show that Tom had done at the Gray. And it was this, he was just enormously grateful and happy to meet Tom. So it was a really wonderful introduction to the prehistory of Tom that I didn't really know about. So Gary gave me some information then. The video clip that we saw earlier, which was done by an intern who was at the Zimmerli Art Museum and was really mentored by Tom. His name is Sam Vladimirsky. So Sam's film also brought a lot of things that Tom, you know, he worked with us for 2.5 years, and he was, you know, he was a fantastic director if you were a curator who knew what you wanted to do, because he let you do whatever you wanted. He was very encouraging, and as Rosalind Fox Solomon said, he just let you do what you wanted to do. So so the Tiananmen Square show that we did was under his watch, and you know, it was really bringing back into history this idea of the massacre of the students in Tiananmen Square at a time when there was a lot of protests in the street in America. And you know, Tom was really interested in pushing people's buttons and getting people to talk about difficult subjects and using the art museum as a place for difficult conversations and controversial subjects. So, you know, he was a very important director for the moment that we had him. And I think, you know, we look back now and think of the exhibitions that he wanted to do that you know, probably won't come into fruition. But I'll just say one more thing. When he came, one of the first things he wanted to do was a show about scandals in art history. So everything from Manet's Olympia to, you know, the AIDS images in Act Up, and you know, everything that really was scandalous. So we had many conversations about the scandalous moments in art history, and he knew things from the classical past all the way up to the 20th century and 21st century. So
thanks, Donna.
Sure.
Yeah, thinking about and when you watch the longer piece by Sam Vladimirsky, the longer documentary, it has these amazing moments about him at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU as a student and doing these kind of large scale events for, you know, just for as a part of being a student there. And also some of the shows that he did as the director of the Gray Art Gallery were so important in the 80s and 90s to establishing a kind of intellectual core to like an artist's work in production and connecting it to the cultural moment. And I guess, Perry, I'd like to go to you now to talk about this question about your work, since you work in public health, and how, I guess, something I would sort of shift this question a bit to be about how do you see the role of the arts, and in particularly the arts and its relationship to HIV and AIDS advocacy, yes, with public, its relationship and maybe non-relationship to public health and what you do?
Well, so first of all, thank you for having me here. And you know, I will say it was interesting because I arrived at Rutgers at the same time that Tom arrived at Rutgers, and we were both at NYU before. And he was doing visual aids, and I was doing ACT UP, and I was at GMHC, and our lives just intersected in these myriad ways over the last 40 years. So to find ourselves at Rutgers all of a sudden in 2017 was interesting, to say the least, but this path had brought us here for some reason, and here we are today. So I will say that one of the most incredible things I'm trying to like make sense in my late 50s of this period of time, right, in a way that's not just based on deficit, but is based on strength and resilience. And I think a lot of amazing things came out of the 80s and the early 90s and the beginning of the epidemic. And certainly, you know, we'll never forget the thousands that we've lost. But what I think did happen was that we began to understand how science and art go hand in hand, and how the arts have things to teach science, and how science have things to teach the arts. So for the course of my career as an HIV researcher, I have been infusing the arts as much as possible. I strongly believe that the work of ACT UP is theater. It was great theater. It won an Obie Award, for God's sake, ACT UP, because of the street theater that they did. Visual aids brought to light, these images about a disease that, people were only talking about in scientific ways. And so when I took on this role as Dean of the School of Public Health, one of the first things we did was have art from Mason Gross students put up in the hallways of our public health school that depict public health. Right? Because we cannot think about these things as separate. And I think Tom understood this in a really profound way, that these interdisciplinary synergies have to exist, that these isolations and these boundaries between the arts and science and medicine are false, right? And in fact, art and science, if we are to do our work really effectively, is ultimately sits on the foundation of activism. And I think that's what visual aids did. And I think that's what ACT UP did. And I think that's what my school's doing now. This notion, especially in this particular moment with COVID-19, I think there's going to be incredible contributions to the world of art coming out of this last horrific year that people have been stuck in their homes and watching death all around them. So public health, I am the first to say this to my fellow scientists: the arts show us the way. Scientists tend to be safe and we tend to follow, and the arts open the doors for us and give us the space to then do the science that I think is effective in changing people's lives. And Tom was really a really critical voice in making that happen.
Great, thank you for that. I was thinking about your work in the community tracing cores, and even like the idea of not propaganda, but outreach, and how so much of what, say, visual aids and ACT UP were after was creating a public dialogue through like the form of art, and trying to think about that as it exists right now in kind of the kind of political situation that we're in, certainly, right? With
Right. And, and I think, I think the folks who are working in the departments of health throughout the country have their work cut out for them right now, right? So, contact tracing was supposed to work this summer so that we wouldn't end up where we are right now, but we are here right now, right? And contact tracing is whatever it is. But one of the things that we did do in the program, to the point here, is, we did talk about cultural humility, and we did infuse, a lot of it was not just about how you ask questions, but the tone in which you use to ask those questions, and how the arts and theater informed the way the contact tracing was done. And it was successful to some extent, but it's really hard to fight these political forces that make contact tracing and mask wearing anathema.
Yeah. I think since we are already pretty far into our time, I thank you so much for all of your sort of reflections. And I've only met Tom once, and I'm new to Rutgers as of last year, so I've actually had very little time on campus, to be real. But I was at an open, one of the Zimmerli's open events, and done a tour with Jeanine Oleson of one of the show that she curated with my students. And then I was eating away, getting ready to go home, and came up and introduced himself, and I didn't realize who he was because of my long relationship to visual aids. I thought it was, later I realized it, and I was like, oh, it's so strange. I wish I would have known. We had so much to talk about. That's life, right? So I just wanted to ask this another question. I think maybe we don't have to go in a row, but if some of you just sort of would like to jump in and talk about how you see HIV and AIDS advocacy work shifting over over your years of engagement, over how you understand the years of engagement, and how do the arts remain vital to that work?
So I'm going to jump in here really quickly. So I think the most important thing we have, look, I find ourselves in this very strange time where I have conversations with people who think that it's over, who say, oh, but there's medication, right? It's over, right? And it's hardly over, as we all know, and there's 40,000 new infections each year. So advocacy and activism are just as important, but I think that is based on really training a new generation on the history of this epidemic, and getting them to sit in the space where they realize what was going on in the 80s. My niece, who worked in my lab for a while, after she watched The Normal Heart on HBO, said to me, I've always respected you. Now I really, really respect you after watching that. So I think we need to help a new generation and get infused with the experiences we had during that time. Fortunately, they don't have to live through that chaos and hell that many of us did, but activism is as important as ever, especially when we see a disease that continues to affect the most marginalized people of our society. Gay men, gay Black men, poor gay Black men, trans women, and that is just an indication of the social inequities that continue to perpetuate this disease and COVID-19. No one should be surprised if COVID-19 is killing more Black people than white people, right? Because it's the same social structural dynamics that are at play. So if we're to affect health in a positive way in our society, we have to be activist and political in our approaches, and art is really an important aspect of that.
And I find that this experience of the COVID pandemic for a younger generation is a great opportunity to talk about that period in the 80s and 90s that was so devastating with AIDS. I've done a number of talks this year to classes and about either artists from the 80s or people's work in the 80s, but talking to a younger generation, and to be able to talk about one pandemic to people who are going through another one, and to talk about the differences and to talk about what it was like. It's so much more relevant to them now. It's really a great time to be doing that.
I'd be curious how you would think about that, especially thinking about like the shift in advocacy, Nelson, and because of how much work you've done even recently in kind of shepherding visual aids and that major shift in the past 10 years, I think, towards thinking about that advocacy towards, even this video program, the transmissions program, was about the HIV/AIDS epidemic outside of the United States primarily, right? And that the video we saw was so much about sort of tearing down these ideas of respectability and what does that mean in terms of how one takes care of oneself, right? And that as a kind of model for what's happening now.
Yeah, that video reminded me of sort of a mashup of like David Wojnarowicz and Cookie Mueller and Chloe Zabello. Like it had that very like Lower East Side, from the time we're sort of talking about the 80s, 90s. Yeah, I was really taken by that video. But I'm just going to back up a little bit. So like I said, I moved to New York in 2000, started visual aids that same year. So I didn't have the same sort of like early experience of HIV/AIDS in New York, like the early days of ACT UP and such. I was in California at that time and in Chicago, and so it's not like I wasn't involved, but I didn't have that same sort of experience. But so when I started in 2000, actually, no one was talking about AIDS anymore, like, so 96, 97, when the cocktail came about, and it didn't, as other people said, it was very much like, well, AIDS is over. It was at Visual Aids, like that first year, we were talking about closing our doors because, you know, are we, there are no exhibitions. There's sort of like, it's hard to sort of get people's attention. You know, is it time to sort of shift? And we had a town hall, and people were like, no one else is doing what you're doing, like, please, you know, mostly the artist members. So we continued, and, you know, I was looking at a timeline recently, and like now with speaking generationally, you know, now we have a younger generation who actually is very interested in that time frame, and have seen exhibitions that touch upon that. But that really started like in the early 2010s, like 2012, 13 is when all of these shows started to come up again, like the first 5 years at the Historical Society, or 1993 at the New Museum, or the 80s show that started, I believe, in Chicago, that started to sort of like bring back that history. But really from those first 10 years, we struggled to have people, you know, give us a space for an exhibition, and we really struggled on Day Without Art during that time too. People weren't so interested anymore of like, you know, covering the artwork or shutting the doors, or, you know, occasionally maybe having someone speak. So it really went from little discussion to coming back again. And I remember going to so many exhibitions early on where like there'd be a Keith Haring or a David Wojnarowicz or Felix Gonzalez Torres, and there'd be no mention that they died of HIV/AIDS. There's like no, like, it was, they so far wanted to remove it from the discussion of the work. Like the work was one thing and HIV/AIDS was something else. And now it's the opposite. Now, like when you go, there's almost always a connection back again. So, and I think that's for multiple reasons. I often think of it generationally as sort of as like how sometimes you're closer to your grandparents than your parents, you know, like there was a generation between the ACT UP and the current younger generation who is very interested, but the middle generation was maybe a little bit felt put upon, or was like maybe just really tired, or like there was lots of things that sort of like created a distance, wanting to move on, and also like a trauma as well too. That generation often grew up feeling like, if I have, you know, I'm going to eventually die because everyone was dying prior, and I'm a gay man, and if I have sex, that's going to happen. And so I felt like that there was a lot of reasons these generations weren't speaking, and now that dialogue is happening again for multiple reasons. And to sort of go a little bit with what Perry said, one of the things at Visual Aids that was a changing point for me is those early years, the direction of talking or creating things at Visual Aids was very much still about a little bit about personal responsibility. It was like, use a condom, safe for sex, and like creating condom packs and such. And then we kind of shifted, working with Amy Sadao, we kind of shifted to thinking it in more political and society terms, in that just using HIV/AIDS as a lens to look at social justice issues in general, like who's still suffering from HIV/AIDS, you know, who has access to healthcare, and just using that as a lens to discuss these bigger issues. So I do think that my time, there has been a really big shift, and there's always some generational loss, you know, like I just started learning a lot about the Spanish flu through COVID, you know, like I didn't know about that, you know, so like there's lots of times where you just don't, you know, a certain amount of history, but you don't. But I do think that one thing that has carried through is the way activism worked. You know, obviously ACT UP took a lot from civil rights and other activist groups prior, but the way they shifted the visuals in ACT UP, that, like Perry said, that lots of it became performative. I think I read something where Tom talks about you recognize the font in ACT UP posters, like that became like a protest kind of font. And that is definitely something I feel like that has continued through and changed, but also heightened the way activists work today. So those are some of my thoughts.
I just, I think that the issue of visuality and the way ACT UP especially created those performances on the street that were disseminated through through newspapers and, either you saw it because you were there in New York, or you saw it on TV, or you saw it in a newspaper, or you saw it somewhere else. But those photographs then carried much further. And it's very interesting to think about that kind of visual theater, and then the if we're thinking about the pandemic today and the sort of visual theater of the mask or no mask, and then how Black Lives Matter has taken up a lot of the performance aspects of ACT UP, and by lying down in the streets or being handcuffed and having the police actually unhandcuff them to take them away, so that there's, I think the legacy of visual aids and ACT UP has remained and really been a very important aspect of visual culture and political art that it's interesting to just kind of think about as on that level.
Also, I'm going to say one other thing about Day Without Art and visual aids and Tom and the founders in general is that it's sort of the sort of marketing genius behind it all as well too. Like, everyone knows about World AIDS Day. Unfortunately, not everyone knows what Day Without Art is anymore, but they really wouldn't know about World AIDS Day without Day Without Art, because World AIDS Day happened the year before. It happened in '88, and the first Day Without Art was in '89. But there was very little news coverage at all about World AIDS Day that first year. And granted, it was like the first year or whatnot, but World AIDS Day was about disseminating information, choosing a day to disseminate information, but it didn't have the show that Day Without Art created. And so when Day Without Art happened, it was that became like newsworthy clips, right? And so then it was a way to sort of talk about all the issues about Day Without Art and tie it also to World AIDS Day, which I think was a really sort of ingenious way of making, like those two ideas weren't purposely overlapped. Like, it's not like, they didn't speak as a group to how to do this, but I think that, at the time when so many were working on these ideas, I like the way they took that and moved it forward. And then the other really important thing that Tom and Robert and Bill and Gary and then Philip Yenaway and everyone else who was involved in the beginning as well too with Day Without Art is like the very, very first thought, or my understanding of the first sort of like thought was to make institutions close their doors. Like, that was the way that they were going to sort of make a statement, right? But as they started talking to institutions, they were like, we can't close our doors for that one day. Our income relies too much on that. Like, there's all these reasons we can't do that. And so instead of sticking to that, like, idea of like, this is what Day Without Art is about, they opened it up for any institution to sort of take it on the way they wanted, which included like covering up artwork or dimming the lights or having a speaker, or later on having a complete exhibitions. And again, I feel like that's kind of the genius of that project, is that it was presented, but then it was open to other ways people can mold it and change it. And same for the red ribbon, like Alan was speaking about as well too. Like, it was a simple but very powerful symbol. But there were times like every AIDS organization has a red ribbon as part of the logo, basically, right? And so there's been times where like, well, if that was copywritten, like, would we have made the money to continue to sustain ourselves? But on the other hand, if it wasn't this free, open, performative kind of project that anyone can cut a ribbon, can wear it, to put it on, and that it was as accessible for a grandmother to wear as someone who's protesting, it wouldn't have taken on that huge life. So I think that there's a real marketing, or let's call it an artistic marketing skill that happened, that that definitely the founders were a large part of, and then the artist caucus, of course, as well, and everyone else who was part of it that makes it still here today.
It was interesting. Greg Bordowitz spoke at in the art and design lecture series this fall, and he was speaking a lot about ACT UP and talking about having a room with a lot of very brilliant agitprop like strategy people with really amazing like artists and designers who were incredibly good at developing agitprop strategy, and also like thinking about Red Ribbon as something that could be viral, right? Like if that's what I think about is it has a kind of virality potential in what we are so familiar with in terms of social media now, but it's just interesting to think about whether to own it or not. And I read somewhere that where Tom was saying like, oh, I didn't like it. I thought it was a little over the, I thought it was garish. I can't remember what word he used. It wasn't garish, but it was a great word like garish. But he's like, but everyone else wanted to do it, and I'm glad they did. So it's also like this showing this kind of belief in the collective, you know.
People forget how taboo it was to bring it up, and you know, in a general situation or in public. You know, there was such a taboo, and that was one of the things that, for me, just having a friend who went into a coma and had not told any of his friends that he was struggling with AIDS, and then it all came out because he, you know, he survived a coma and then told everybody. But just that he, as a gay man living in New York City in 1989 or 90, felt that much of a stigma, you know, it's something that's hard to realize at this point and later too, you know, and that was part of it. It was just to make the subject visible and discussable and bring it into public life. And, you know, when the Democratic and Republican conventions in the summer of '92 came around, the Democrats were all wearing the red ribbon in the convention. And then there was this moment in the Republican convention when Barbara Bush was seen wearing one. And then the next time you saw her, it had been taken off because it was still in 1992 too controversial to bring that up in such a sphere.
I think it's like I don't think it's all so much better right now. You know, I think that, you know, while we've made advances in medicine, while we've made advances in keeping people alive, the stigma is still very much exists. The stigma still perpetuates the disease. You know, I live my life as a very proud gay HIV positive man, but I will tell you that at Rutgers, that doesn't always feel comfortable to people. Right? And that's their problem. That's not my problem. You know, and I can see it again today when I wrote an op-ed about HIV criminalization and likening it to COVID criminalization. And I spoke about the 5 men who I'd lost in my life over the course of the last 40 years, how that just sort of like made people like dance around me, you know, all day long. And I think that I, and for my part, and you as artists for your part, just have to continue to put it out there, so that it becomes HIV continues to be stigmatized unless we normalize it. Gay continues to be stigmatized unless we normalize it. And so normalization is about speaking about it, right? And having it be in every sector. By the way, let me just do one recommendation. The Prettiest Star, I'm reading that novel right now. New York, 80s, guy dying from AIDS, goes back to his hometown in Ohio. It's really amazing. Sorry, that's I didn't write it, so I'm not getting any money. I'm just telling you that it's really enjoyable.
Thanks for that. I don't know about that.
Yeah, it just came out.
I think also it's the shift from this being a sort of the gay cancer so far into being something that's like a part of as you know, in terms of public health, marginalized populations and globally, right? And the effect of HIV and AIDS has gone far and wide. And I think like something that I think about what Visual AIDS has been up to is really moving that focus quite a bit and really kind of interrogating that from a cultural perspective of, you know, to change the optics very much. And it's interesting to think about the optics around a red ribbon and then to think about the optics around a mask. And, you know, that those are they have these symbolic powers in two different pandemics, right? And I mean, that's quite interesting.
The mask is as controversial as the condom was.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm right. I mean, so it's like, you know, we forget that when Larry Kramer, God bless him, told us that we should stop having sex and wear condoms, we were like, oh no, we have to have sex. We can't wear a condom. And so we act shocked now that people don't want to wear a mask, right? Because I'm not shocked by it. It seems like exactly the same thing that I experienced in the 80s with gay men around me who were fighting for their liberation. Maybe this time around, it's not as, maybe the folks who are fighting for their liberation now are not, perhaps don't have the same, you know, reasoning behind it, but it's kind of the same psychological process that's at play.
Interesting. Should we open this up for questions a bit more? Since we're after 8 at this point. We get any questions rolling in? There is a question. Let's see. I just see that there is a question, but I don't see what the question is.
It says, what does the very existence of an organization like Visual AIDS suggest about what we might expect from a post-COVID art world? Yeah, it's interesting, you know.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Alan.
I was just going to say that I've been at Visual AIDS many times in the last year because they are doing really significant books. They're working on their 3rd monograph of an artist with HIV/AIDS, Daryl Ellis, who was born in 1958 and died in 1992. He was a close friend of mine, and I've been advising his family and storing his work all of these years. And Nelson really wanted to get this work into the archive before he left, and that was the trigger. And I just, you know, like, it was long overdue. And the archive that they create, which curators draw from to do the online shows that Visual AIDS presents, it's so important. But Visual AIDS got a grant from the Warhol Foundation to do a monograph on this artist who died at the age of 33. That year that he died, MoMA included him in their new photography show, their annual show. And then I curated a show at Art in General in '96 of the work. And then it was in a couple of group shows, but you know, the market was not interested, therefore galleries were not interested. And 15 years later, there was a show last year that just hit the moment right, and museums bought work, and Visual AIDS has been working on, you know, getting young artists to come in to react to the work, to put their comments into the book, to get people to write about it, to put into the book. And it's so interesting that, you know, the time it'll come out in the fall of 2021. But one of the really significant parts of this body of work is that he basically did all this work in a 10-year span after he found a whole archive of his father's negatives from the 1950s. So all of those family scenes are based on photographs that his father took in New York in the 1950s of their family. But Thomas Ellis, the father, was murdered by the police in 1958, a couple of months before Daryl was born. So Daryl never knew him. And he grew up with a stepfather whom his mother divorced when he was a teenager. So nobody really talked to him about his father until he was about 22. He discovered this trove of images and then started working with that and reinterpreting them and creating this amazing body of work that goes from experimental photography to drawings to paintings. And the self-portraits that he did later, and can you go to number 3? There's that is from a Peter Hujar photograph that was in the show at the Gray Gallery that Tom Sokolowski curated. And the way that this story coincides with all the social justice, Black Lives Matter protests in the last year is really interesting, since Daryl is, basically grew up in this family fractured through a police murder of his father, who was arrested on a minor traffic violation and killed on the way to the precinct. It's, it's a horrific early instance of what we've seen too many times. And the relevance of that to that moment in our political history is really interesting. And there's going to be a museum show of this work. The Baltimore Museum of Art and other museums are talking about a show that they will be doing in the next few years. Plus, this book will come out. Visual Aids also does a series called Duets, which are conversations between two people, either about someone else's work or about their work. And Visual Aids is also producing a kind of retrospective view of all of their projects over the last 30 years. And Nelson, you started Duets, didn't you?
I did,
That
yeah.
series.
It's a project that I always was drawn to, and so I was fortunate enough to be able to start that there. But seeing Daryl's work reminds me of a really important point that I feel like maybe ties to that question, in that, especially for those who aren't familiar with Visual Aids artist registry. So Visual Aids has an artist registry where HIV positive artists, you can see the work of HIV positive artists, both those living with HIV AIDS and those who passed away, on the website, like Daryl's work. But an important reminder is that lots of the work that's on the website and lots of the work that people continue to do isn't necessarily about HIV/AIDS, right? Like there certainly is work that is very direct on different sort of levels. There's less kind of like that activist, act up kind of work that we were talking about, and more kind of like personal work. But the reason I was thinking about that is in this question, it says, what does the very existence of an organization like Visual Aids suggest about what we might expect from a post-COVID art world? When you say post-COVID, to me, that's sort of like post-AIDS. I'm not sure that we'll ever be in that situation, but I do think that the effects are greater and deeper than we think, right? Like that the work that came out of that time frame, or continues to come out from artists living with HIV/AIDS, hits upon things like Daryl's work about issues of race and issues of equity and isn't necessarily specifically about HIV/AIDS, but was triggered by the time itself. And I think that I'm not seeing a whole lot of work about COVID right now, but I imagine that down the line, the way COVID has affected us all, isolated us, changed the way we communicate, will then start to reflect in the artwork and the art world and beyond, of course.
And that's a question from Sam Vladimirsky, who made the documentary. Thank you, Sam. Is there any other questions? I think there might be one coming in from a raised hand, but if not, we should probably wrap it up. I think, yeah, is anything? Oh, Amy, did you have a question? Okay, maybe not. I'd just like to thank everyone, Donna, Nelson, Alan, and Perry for coming together tonight in honor of Day Without Art, and also in honor of Tom's life and work, which touched all of you at different times in different ways. And I'm really, I hope everyone has a chance to also look at the larger program, transmissions program, and also follow some of the work of seeing that the monograph of Daryl Ellis's work that will come out next year. And Alan, you've taken care of that work for 20 years, you know, and
30 almost.
30, yeah. So making sure that you know it's finding its audiences now, and we're finding this conversation, I think, again, like generationally, through organizations like Visual AIDS, and just how it's a part of a lot of organizations now.
And that's an example of when I talk about it, which I've been doing a lot recently, and it younger people now can relate so much more to it because they're in this other pandemic, and then it opens that up. Also, the story about his father, of course, opens that whole thing up.
Absolutely. So thank you to everyone who's come tonight to be with us as well, and thanks so much to each of you here speaking tonight.
Thanks, Jeanine.
Thanks, Jeanine.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jeanine.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, so much. And Perry had to run to another event. I'm sure this is a very busy day for him, but we're going to thank him as well. So yes, thank you all for a fascinating conversation, really interesting and informative about the past and our present situation as well. So I want to thank our colleagues again at Zimmerli, Mason Gross, Rutgers Global School of Public Health, and our other supporters for today's programming. And we hope we'll see you at another event soon, and we wish you the best of health.